How did Lieutenant General Bernard Law Montgomery reconfigure the 8th Army as it prepares to transition to the offensive? We look at the Battle of El Alamein and the preparations for Operation Lightfoot in the Second Battle of El Alamein.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 84 of the Principles of War podcast. This podcast is a part of our series looking at the Second Battle of El Alamein, in particular, the Australian artillery component of that. Because this is part of our series commemorating 150 years of permanent artillery in Australia. We are slowly but surely moving to where we will be talking about the artillery at the Second Battle of El Alamein, and it is a fascinating story. However, today we pick up the story with the death of Lieutenant General Gott. This was Churchill's first choice for commander of 8th Army after the failure at 1st El Alamein. Auchinleck had managed to stop the Axis advance, however, his counterattack failed. Churchill was under significant political pressure and he needed a victory. Auchinleck was sacked, and by way of battlefield promotion, Montgomery takes over command of the 8th Army. This is actually a very important lesson in and of itself. In the show notes, I'll place a link to a lecture that was conducted by Thomas E. Ricks from the Center for a New American Security. And he asked the question, why our generals were more successful in World War II than in Korea, Vietnam, or Iraq, Afghanistan. And his theory is that in World War II, you could be sacked. It's a fascinating lecture because he posits that since World War II, there's been less accountabilities placed on our generals for battlefield success. His lecture looks at the reasons for this, the difference in what sacking a general meant back in World War II as opposed to now, and critically, the impact that it's had on the outcomes for when we choose to use military power and the success or lack thereof that is generated by that. With this podcast episode, we're going to look at the Battle of El Alamein. We're going to look critically at how Monty conducted himself and reconfigured the 8th Army for success after he took over and prepared it for Operation Lightfoot, which was the first part of the Second Battle of El Alamein. We're not going to go into too much details of El Alamein or even Second El Alamein, but what we are going to look at is a couple of things. Firstly, what were the steps that Montgomery took to generate maximum fighting power in the 8th Army? And a related question is, how did he turn around the 8th Army? 8th Army at this point in the war was not a successful army. Rommel had moral dominance over it. There were significant concerns within the British cabinet, all the way down to the soldiers, that Cairo was going to fall. 8th Army was a large organisation at this point. It would cross the line of departure with over 190,000 men. Complicating the reorganisation and unification of purpose behind 8th Army was the fact that it had soldiers from across the British Empire, British, South African, New Zealand, Australian, as well as Greece, Poland and France. And Montgomery knew that he did not have a lot of time. He had incredible political pressure to generate a victory, and he also knew that Rommel was going to strike before he was ready to attack himself. So what were the steps that he took to turn the 8th Army around? And I think that's a really important skill for a general. Matthew Ridgway was able to do this in Korea after he took over after the death of Lieutenant General Walton Walker. He took over the 8th US Army, an army that was still in a tactical retreat after the overwhelming offensive from the Chinese and North Koreans. I do think that it's moderately unlikely that any of our esteemed listeners today are going to take over command of an army that is in headlong retreat and with really poor morale. However, I do think that the lessons we're going to learn about Montgomery and his actions are applicable for anyone who takes over command of any sized unit, all the way down to a platoon or even a section. I really do think we'll be able to distill some really good lessons from that. For Montgomery, though, it actually wasn't that bad a time to be taking over as Army commander. In fact, he had some significant advantages. Firstly, there was a fundamental change in the information asymmetry that had prevailed in the Desert War. Rommel had lost his key source of intelligence. And I think as a general, it's a lot easier to fight well if you're reading your opponent's mail. This was what Rommel was doing. However, after First El Alamein, he was blinded with the capture of Unit 621 by Australian forces in a limited counterattack. If you want more details on that, definitely check out our two-part series on deception planning. We look at how he lost Unit 621, a signals intercept and interpretation unit, and the impact that it had for him. We also look at the deception plan, which had been organised by Auchinleck. There was a lot of work that had already been done in building up a deception capability within the 8th Army. There were entire companies dedicated to developing the material that would be needed to conduct a deception plan. Also, although the 8th Army had been beaten, strategically the situation was definitely turning in favour of the Allies and 8th Army in particular. The Royal Navy is strangling Rommel's supplies. He is not getting all of the supplies that have been allocated to him, but it's important to remember that all of the supplies that have been allocated to him is not exactly a large amount of supplies because Germany is fighting the Battle of Stalingrad. So that commenced the 23rd of August 1942. That's around 2 months before Second El Alamein. So he is not the main effort. That is the Eastern Front and in particular the Battle for Stalingrad. So his secondary allocation of resources is constrained even further. By interdiction from the Royal Navy and the Allied Air Force. As Rommel's supply dwindle, Monty's are increasing. He gets a delivery of 100 self-propelled guns, 300 Shermans. The Shermans will perform very well in the desert. And he also gets the replacements for the 2-pounder anti-tank guns. And we will talk quite a bit about the anti-tank battle. Added to this is the capability of the Desert Air Force to generate local air superiority on an increasingly frequent basis. Monty would later write of the time when he had taken over 8th Army, and he said, "The magnitude of the task in front of me was beginning to be apparent. I must have someone to help me, a man with a quick and clear brain who would accept responsibility and who would work out the details and leave me free to concentrate on the major issues. In fact, a chief of staff who could handle all the details and intricate staff side of the business and leave me free to command." Before we arrived at 8th Army headquarters, I had decided that de Guingand was the man. I would make him chief of staff with full powers and together we would do the job. I never regretted the decision. The de Guingand that Monty speaks of is Major General Sir Francis Wilfrid or Freddie de Guingand, CBE, CB, DSO. He graduated from the Royal Military College Sandhurst in 1918, so he didn't actually see any combat in World War I. But it was at RMC that he acquired the nickname Freddy after Freddy the Frog, a cartoon character which was a reference to his French surname. He had only been promoted to Major in 1938. As often happens in wartime, promotions followed much more quickly following the commencement of hostilities, and in February 1942 he was promoted to the role of Director of Military Intelligence Middle East with the rank of Brigadier. After First El Alamein, Auchinleck would appoint him as Brigadier General Staff Operations for 8th Army. Montgomery sought out his opinion of what the issues had been with the conduct of the 8th Army, and de Guingand said that there was the dangerous looking over the shoulder defensive policy, that there was an unsound fashion that prevailed in fighting by battle groups and jock columns and not in divisions as the army had been trained to fight. Also, there was an unsatisfactory headquarters setup, and lastly, the fact that Army and Air headquarters were not together. This information would be part of what Montgomery would use to come up with his plan to transition the 8th Army to successful offensive operations. Monty knew from ultra decrypts that Rommel would attack before the 8th Army was ready to resume the offensive. This is because Rommel was being impaled on the horns of a temporal dilemma. He was running out of time. Montgomery was getting more supplies. He was getting nowhere near enough supplies. The casualties that the Panzer Army Africa had suffered during First El Alamein were significant, but there wouldn't be time to replace those losses. The situation for Rommel was not good. In fact, it was quite poor. But he needed to attack, and he needed to attack soon before the situation deteriorated further. Monty, on the other hand, needed time to turn the morale around of the 8th Army. It also needed to absorb new weapons into the organisation. The soldiers then needed to be trained not only on those weapons, but how to fight as a combined arms force. And Montgomery wanted to generate that combined arms capability at the divisional and corps level. Not only did he want to train the army to be able to orchestrate and synchronise effects much better, but he wanted to be able to do it at a much larger scale. On the 17th of August 1942, an Enigma decrypt arrived in Cairo, and this is probably the single most important item of information that Enigma had contributed to the Desert Campaign. It was the scheme of manoeuvre for Rommel's attack. So now we have Montgomery reading Rommel's mail rather than Rommel reading the Allies' mail. A significant advantage. Panzer Army Africa would need to be moving at night because of the strength of the Desert Air Force. That would mean that they would need a full or near to full moon, which gave Montgomery the timing of the attack. With the Ultra Decrypt, he had the place of the attack. Montgomery took the existing plan that Auchinleck had been working on for the resumption of the offensive. However, he put his own 8-point plan over the top of that. First, there would be no withdrawal. So transport for the withdrawal of units was to be moved to the rear and defences would be strengthened, and Class 1, 3 and 5 supplies would be stockpiled. So Class 1, rations, Class 3, petrol, oil and lubricant or POL, and Class 5, ammunition. So remember the mnemonic, Classes 1, 3 and 5 will keep you alive. They are the 3 classes that you need to be able to fight. Secondly, there would be no more jock columns. The army would fight as an army with centralised artillery. Third, he would build up a strong, balanced force. Fourth, develop a corps de chasse under General Lumsden. So this would be a hunting corps, an armoured corps, ready to achieve decisive action. 5. If Rommel attacked during the August full moon period, he would be confronted by dug-in anti-tank guns and hull-down tanks. 6. The headquarters of 8th Army would be co-located with the Desert Air Force headquarters. 7. There would be no more belly aching, and orders would be treated as orders, not the basis for further discussion. 8. No more failure. Risks were to be minimised, and there were no shortcuts to victory. The problem with the ad hoc arrangements that were coming out of 8th Army up until that point, so the jock columns and the battle groups, was twofold. Firstly, they were an attempt to replicate the offensive actions that Rommel had been taking. He would have small, balanced forces that would move out and conduct a raid. And in that role, they can be very effective. However, they don't have sufficient combat power to be able to support themselves if they are engaged by a larger force. If the jock column is supported by a battery of guns, or even smaller, how much offensive support are they able to provide? It's not a lot. And the same goes for the engineering effect if they've got engineers attached, or tanks if they've got any armour attached. Also, they were combined on an ad hoc basis. So rather than training together and fighting together, different units were put together for different tasks all the time. So they never got to understand how the other elements of the jock column would fight together. Montgomery put an end to that. When we look at the employment of artillery at the Second El Alamein battle, we will definitely be discussing the centralisation of artillery, but it wasn't just artillery that Montgomery was very keen to centralise. He also did that with 10th Corps. This would be his corps de chasse, his hunting corps, his armoured corps. He was going to put as many tanks as he could together so that he would really have that armoured fist that he would be able to punch through the German defences and then exploit into the rear of the German positions. There was, however, a problem with this. Not only would General Lumsden's 10th Corps and the other armoured divisions within 8th Army be transitioning to new tanks, so 300 Shermans had come in. This was a completely new vehicle. They hadn't fought in this before, nor trained in it, so there was time required for them to understand how to manoeuvre and how to fight in the Shermans. Not only that, but the tactical proficiency of the Armoured Corps was not to Montgomery's liking. In training manoeuvres which Montgomery observed, he found that there was a lack of tactical proficiency and a lack of offensive spirit. At the operational level within the Middle Eastern theatre of operations, Montgomery would have assessed the centre of gravity of the Panzer Army Africa as being their armoured units. In particular, the panzer divisions, plus or minus the motorised troops as well. There was a sustained effort to strike at the critical vulnerability of the logistics that would support the manoeuvre for the panzer divisions. This was generated at the operational level because we've got the Navy working to sink ships, as well as the Air Force conducting maritime strike missions to sink convoys. In particular, the convoys containing the tankers with that precious fuel for Rommel's tanks. Co-locating 8th Army headquarters with the Desert Air Force headquarters would mean that he would be able to influence the targeting cycle, ensuring that logistics columns would be a high payoff target. When we look at the Panzer Army Africa attack at Alam Halfa, why wasn't there a more Rommel-esque plan? It was because he simply didn't have the fuel for it. He was hoping that he could temporarily dislocate the 8th Army by attacking before it was ready. However, Montgomery had already deduced when the attack would start, because of the requirement for them to manoeuvre under moonlight so that they wouldn't be at the mercy of the Desert Air Force. These are the steps that Montgomery took to increase the ability of the 8th Army to generate fighting power. What is fighting power? According to LWD-1, the Australian Army's capstone document, as a concept, fighting power is the way in which Army generates its capacity through the integration of the physical, moral and intellectual components at both the individual and organisational level. The intellectual components provides the knowledge of war, warfare and cognitive capability, the what to think. The moral component reinforces culture, values and legitimacy, the will to fight, and the physical components provide Army's capabilities and functional effects, the means to fight. When all three components interact, Army's capacity to operate in the future environment will be strengthened. Now, Monty would never have read LWD-1, certainly wouldn't have read any doctrine coming from a Dominion country, but based on all of his experience in World War I and his experience during the Battle of and his work preparing for the defence of Great Britain, you can see that already instinctively he was thinking along these lines. And he was able to highlight the problems that the 8th Army had. Intellectually, it wasn't fighting in the way that the army had been trained for, nor the way that the doctrine said that the battle should be conducted. Armour and artillery were being penny-packeted and unable to generate the effect of a main effort. The moral component had been degraded by a series of defeats inflicted on it by Rommel, and the cult of the personality general was becoming all-pervasive within 8th Army. Physically, there'd been a lack of material, both in quantity and quality, to be able to achieve the effects required to overcome Panzer Army Africa. Let's look at these three components, intellectual, physical, and moral. What is it that's written in the doctrine? So for the intellectual component of fighting power, the intellectual component is the way in which knowledge, creativity, and analytical ability are applied to meet military challenges. Past success in battle is no guarantee of future victory, and the army's way of fighting must be subject to constant scrutiny and examination. The intellectual component of fighting power provides the level of understanding necessary for success in the complex battle space and is supported by an organisational climate that enables creativity and innovation, analytical excellence, and continuous learning. Army's organisational climate is predicated on its versatility, agility, and adaptability to enable the innovation essential to success. So 3 components there: versatility, agility, and adaptability. Versatility is the ability to perform a wide array of tasks and activities. This begins with the individuals who must possess many skills at high readiness levels and to mission proficiency. The skills of the individual are further amplified by complementary and supporting group skills. This enables generation of a wide range of high-quality operational options. So for the 8th Army, once Montgomery had settled on the plans, and of course there were significant changes from the initial plan through to going over the LD and after crossing the line of departure, and this is where that versatility comes in, Montgomery ensured that each corps, division, brigade, unit was starting to train in the tasks that they were likely to see as the attack progressed. That training started at a very low level, looking at individual skills, and worked its way up. Platoon, company, battalion, brigade, assaults, doing things like crossing minefields, working with tanks, using artillery, all of the key skills that would generate that combined arms effect. Next in the intellectual component is agility, and that is the ability to shift between tasks rapidly. This requires both physical and mental dexterity and begins with the individual soldier. Personnel must be sufficiently physically and mentally tough to analyse problems rapidly, often under great stress, to produce solutions that are realistic and achievable as well as unexpected and unpredictable. These attributes must also be institutionalised within the command structure. We see this in the way that the training program was developed. It was incredibly rigorous and arduous. Long days, longer nights, in the field, training under as close to warlike situations as possible. In this regard, Montgomery, as the Army commander, and Morshead, the commander of the 9th Australian Infantry Division, had very similar mindsets. Both of them thought that the training needed to be very, very tough to enable the troops to be ready for the actual stress and strain of combat. This is borne out by one of the maxims of Field Marshal Alexander Suvorov. He was the generalissimo of the Russian army. He died in 1800, so he never got to fight Napoleon, but all of the generals who fought Napoleon had been trained by Alexander Suvorov, and he said, train hard, fight easy. Morshead, whose nickname was Ming the Merciless, truly believed in this maxim. Lastly, we've got adaptability, the ability to respond to new needs or changes in context without a loss of functionality. This is essential given the inability to predict and anticipate the full range and nature of operational threats. Adaptability is a product of the human component of an organisation, the capacity and willingness to innovate and change to solve a new complex problem or to execute an unexpected mission. 2 things about adaptability. First off, many training exercises are far too scripted, which means that there isn't the requirement for adaptability to be exercised by commanders. And secondly, you can see with adaptability, there's bleeding across into the moral component of the generation of fighting power, because a organisation without strong morale is going to struggle to react to a changing situation, particularly significant setbacks. 9th Division, when we look at 2nd El Alamein, was a highly adaptable organisation that was borne out in multiple instances. In John Coates's Atlas of Australian Wars, he describes a component of the training. In its pre-battle training lay one of the chief differences between Montgomery's methods and those of his predecessors. Apart from the fire of his personality, Montgomery left 2 great legacies among the officers and men of the 9th Australian Division, who were to play a key role during the battle itself. Troops were to train specifically for the role that they were about to perform, and the command and control of the army was to be centralised and fight as an entity, not in bits and pieces, which Rommel previously had dealt with piecemeal. Under Montgomery's direction, the 9th entered the most intensive phase of training in its experience. Its great quality for the troops was that their training simulated the actual events and phases that it would be ordered to perform. The 2nd 13th Battalion's history describes the experience. The task assigned to the 2nd 13th Battalion in the opening phase of moving a battalion with all its supporting arms, including tanks, through enemy minefields and defences at night and fighting it at a depth of some 3,000 to 5,000 yards beyond the front line required thorough and detailed planning. It required rehearsal too, and before the battle, rehearsals were held to the point of exhaustion. Early rehearsals were in daylight on a small scale and were concerned with the more elementary problems of night movement. Gradually, the scale was increased until, in the final exercise, a full-scale dress rehearsal was held, down to the minutest detail of the forthcoming attack. The defences laid down for the purposes of the exercise were in fact, though the fact was not publicised, an exact replica of the defence believed to exist in the area that the battalion would later have to attack. Afterwards, just before the battle, the role of each section was planned and discussed with the men of the section on an accurately scaled sand table model of the future battlefield. This is how you give soldiers the intellectual advantage, the correct preparation to set them up for success. Montgomery knew it, Morshead knew it, and the officers and soldiers of 9th Division would come to understand it implicitly as they saw all of their hard work bear significant dividends as they moved into the attack. You can see how this training program flows into the moral component of the generation of fighting power. These troops had been conducting a withdrawal for 900 miles. So the first thing, the fact that they were training for the offense, that increased morale in and of itself. But the detail of the planning, the detail of their understanding of the task that they would be given, greatly enhanced the confidence that they had. Next, we'll look at the physical. So the physical component of fighting power provides the means to fight. Army describes its physical warfighting capabilities by function, represented by 4 land force elements. These are combat. Combat elements are those land force elements designed to engage the enemy with direct fire weapons. Combat elements include armour, infantry, special forces, and aviation. Combat support. Combat support elements provide offensive support and operational assistance to command elements. Combat support elements include offensive support, ground-based air defence, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities, electronic warfare elements, combat engineers, and the battlefield support aviation. Combat service support are the support elements that support the land force through the provision of sustainment, movement, distribution, health services, personal services, and equipment maintenance activities. And lastly, command support. Command support elements enable commanders to execute their command responsibilities, exercise control, and provide specialist advice. They include headquarters staff, communication and information systems capabilities, public affairs, and civil-military cooperation and military policing. Now, not actually mentioned in that definition, but a fundamental component of the generation of the physical part of fighting power is the quantity and quality of the equipment that can be brought to bear on the enemy. If we look at the combat element, there were 300 new Shermans that were coming into the AO. That's a significant number of tanks, but more importantly, those tanks are going to be significantly better than the tanks that the Panzer divisions are going to be able to field against them. Same in the anti-tank role, the 6-pounder, a much better weapon system than the 2-pounder, which they had been fighting with up until that point. The 2-pounders would be handed off to the infantry so that they would have an organic anti-tank capability. Combat support, there were new guns coming into the field regiments, there were new self-propelled guns coming in to the army. We talk about the ability of the Desert Air Force to generate air superiority or air supremacy, but was also able to contribute greatly to the ISR capability, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And this would play a big role in combat support because it would enable the gunners to win the counter-battery battle. A lot of effort was put into combat service support. There were huge caches that were being developed so that the logistics required for the offensive, once it began, would be as close to the front line as possible. and it would be able to be moved up to the units that required it very quickly. Lastly, combat support. So we've talked a little bit about the changes that Montgomery made within the headquarters of 8th Army. He required his planners to be able to generate the orders that were the embodiment of his intent. His job, as he understood it, was to go out and sell the plan to all of the soldiers, to observe the training, and to instill his will on the commanders. And if he was going to do that, he needed to have a headquarters that was going to be able to generate the orders without him. And we also see the co-location of 8th Army headquarters and Desert Air Force headquarters, so that that joint effect can be generated much quicker, much more easily, rather than the way that it had been generated under Auchinleck. Lastly, we come to the moral component. Army's will to fight is provided primarily by the moral component of fighting power and supplies and sustains the will to fight. The moral component embodies those individual and organisational characteristics that are fundamental to success: morale, integrity, values, and legitimacy. Conflict requires soldiers to act in the face of mortal peril, which demands mental toughness and determination, measured by physical and moral courage. Morale is the collective and individual confidence in an organisation that encourages individuals to subordinate their own welfare to collective goals. It is closely related to their shared sense of purpose and values, esprit de corps, which is supported by spiritual, rational, and material foundations. Morale requires trust between the individual and the organisation, and between individuals in the organisation. High morale sustains individual and collective will in the face of adversity and is thus fundamental to the generation of fighting power. Morale is significantly enhanced by success. The rational foundations of morale reflect the importance of reason. Soldiers should be confident that they have been well prepared for operations. They must be given tasks that are meaningful and provide scope for professional development. Commanders and their staff must acknowledge that their effectiveness is ultimately based on the confidence and respect of their soldiers. Morale is nourished by sound leadership, effective communication, and by meeting the emotional and material needs of individual soldiers and their families to the maximum extent practicable. Integrity is essential to soldiering and sustaining the will to fight, but assumes moral courage. Together with mental toughness, which enables soldiers to overcome physical fatigue, danger, and peer and other pressures. Integrity supports soldiers in making morally right decisions. Successful military operations demand integrity and moral courage at all levels. The importance of a soldier's moral character cannot be overstated in terms of developing and sustaining fighting power. This moral character is sustained through the individual systems of beliefs and values. A shared sense of purpose provides the framework for the application of Army's values of courage, initiative, respect, and teamwork. Lastly, in the moral component is legitimacy, and that refers to perceptions of justice, legality, and morality as they apply to military operations and related actions. At the highest level, legitimacy finds expression in Australia using force only under defined circumstances and in a strictly controlled manner which reflects Australia's approach to war. For Montgomery, the biggest issue in generating the moral component of fighting power was the morale of the 8th Army. To illustrate this, I'll go back to John Coates's book with an excellent quote. An officer in the 9th Australian Division remembered Montgomery's first visit. He came up to see us on top of Hill 33, which was a pretty exposed position to German artillery, and demanded that he be given an Australian hat, which he put on, and it looked like a bucket on his head as he didn't know how to wear it. He got a little group of officers assembled around him and said, "This is good ground. When the enemy attacks, as he will, you will stay here. If you are surrounded, you will stay surrounded. You have fought for this ground and you have won it. You will not give it up. You must now work very hard at digging in supplies, ammunition, food, water, and I repeat, you will stay here. Good morning." And off he went. You could feel the change after all the withdrawals from the western parts of the field. From that day on, there was never any talk of going back. So rather than working on the plans for the defence of Alam Halfa or the attack that would come after that, Operation Lightfoot, Montgomery was out and about, seeing the troops, seeing the officers, making sure that the training was being conducted, it was being conducted to the appropriate level, and that everyone knew what their role was going to be in this great endeavour. His ability to influence the morale continued when he gave his set of orders. In the Australian official history, there's an account of the Australian officers getting their orders for what they'd be doing in the attack. As these men sat before Montgomery, these down-to-earth commanders, to most of whom he had been perforce a distant and somewhat enigmatic figure, as they listened to his precise and clipped but confident speech and perceived his mastery of his subject and the occasion, as they heard from him how strongly the odds were weighted in their favour, as they learnt that this attack was not to be one to be made by 2 brigades or so, but one in which the whole army's force would be arrayed, they developed instantly a strong confidence in the army commander himself and in his plan. So, Army Leadership 101, not only do you need to develop a great plan, but you need to be able to deliver a great set of orders in a way that instills confidence in that plan. When Montgomery became Army Commander, he was given Churchill's intent, and that was direction for action at the earliest possible opportunity. Churchill wanted a September offensive, but Montgomery argued for more time to restore the morale of the battered 8th Army and to allow for in-depth training and the resupply of his forces. After some discussion with General Alexander, the date for the Allied offensive was pushed back to the 23rd of October, when the new full moon would aid the sappers in the clearing of the mines and the advance teams. Montgomery would use the 2 months that he had to improve the morale, improve the supply state, and to improve the morale of the 8th Army. In between that, he'd have to fight the defensive Battle of El Alamein. So, we've looked at the way that Montgomery assumed command. He identified someone that he trusted, who was detail-orientated, and who would be able to act as his chief of staff. He fixed the command arrangements, both within 8th Army and with the Desert Air Force. He worked with his commander, General Alexander, to ensure that he had the time to be able to put his plan in place. But most importantly, he addressed the intellectual, physical, and moral components of the way that the 8th Army had been operating. He set a plan for each one of those to be advanced to the way that he wanted the 8th Army to be able to operate, so that when 8th Army generated fighting power, it would be inordinately greater than Rommel would be able to generate, ensuring victory at the Battle of Second El Alamein. The way that he did this, particularly in the moral domain, I think there are lessons for all of us to learn from. Next episode, we'll look at Alam Halfa very briefly, then we'll look at the Battle of Second El Alamein.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.